Okay, welcome back everybody to our video lecture series. This will be video number 3. And in our Anatomy and Physiology chapter 7. And we're going to talk about, today we're going to talk about the circulatory system. The last video was on the respiratory system. So we travel now to the respiratory system. So let's get to it here. All right, 1 second. Let me set us up here. My bad. Hang on 1 second. And I will get us set up here. Give me just a second. Forgot I do it a little different now that I've changed programs. I like the sound on this. It seems to be pretty good. If you have any comments on the sound, just let me know. I want you to be able to, hear the video well and be able to get something from the videos. I think we're ready now. Let's see. Yep, here we go. Check one more thing. There we go. All right, pointer's working. So yeah, everything seems to be working now, so we can continue. So we talked about the blood and the composition of the blood. We have about 4 to 6 liters of blood. Give or take a few liters depending on the size of the person. We have 2 parts of the blood. We have the cellular part. It's 45%. The cellular part, remember, consists of the red blood cells, the white blood cells, and the platelets. And then the 55% of that we have is plasma. And that's the transport portion. That's what transports that cellular piece throughout the circulatory system. And we talked about the differences there. Being low on plasma here usually references like dehydration. That's the transport mechanism to get the I can't speak, man. I'm having a rough afternoon. The cellular piece of that throughout the circulatory system. Then we have here's a diagram of the plasma. And we break the plasma down to 90% water and 10% dissolved gases. And then we just kind of take a look at the cellular piece now. The red blood cells, white blood cells, and then the platelets. Red blood cells are your blood cells who transport oxygen, and they have hemoglobin that allows that to happen. White blood cells are infection fighters, and then we have the platelets, which are the part of the blood cells that clot, that assists the body in clotting. I had said before on albumin, we'll talk about that in chapter 8. And then there's just some information here about the red blood cells. Interesting facts. The most numerous type, of course, their primary function is to transport oxygen. Their color is from the hemoglobin. And about 120 days that they circulate. Your white blood cells, they guard against infection, they fight against infection. This number, of course, it increases when the body's fighting an infection. That's how we know that you have an infection. When we do blood work, things like that. And then there's platelets. But on the white blood cell thing, I just like to talk about it for another couple of minutes. But when people are under the care of an oncologist for cancer, and they're being treated with chemo and radiation, the white blood cell count tends to drop under that treatment. And the reason why that is because the chemo unfortunately kills good cells along with bad. So we have the white blood cells also being injured in this treatment. And that's one of the things that, that's why one of the reasons why you see chemo patients with a mask on their face to guard against infection, because their body is already compromised. And again, platelets aids the body in clotting. So people who don't have enough platelets, they're known as hemophiliacs. They're free bleeders. A dangerous situation if you're involved in a traumatic incident. And then you have the ones who produce too much platelets and who clot too easily. So, okay, blood's function is to transport, and it's not just the white blood cells, but we learned today that it transports hormones as well. Protection, temperature regulation. I think temperature regulation is a real big one because it's something that we can see or feel. If you have someone who has a blood clot and say it's in their middle thigh, their leg is going to be cool distal to that clot. And the reason why is because temperature regulation, the blood's not able to regulate the temperature in that lower part of the extremity. And so if you have someone you suspect a blood clot or some type of occlusion, you can check for that. And moving right along, again, just more functions of the blood. Delivery of oxygen and glucose is a real big one, right? We need it to survive. But let's not forget that it also aids in removing CO2. So you have your hemoglobin on one side has an affinity for oxygen, and on the other CO2 it's picking up along the way. Gas, whoa, let's back up. Got a little trigger happy, stand by. Transporting blood to the alveoli for gas exchange, right there at the capillary bed. And this is just a diagram of some areas where arteries are located. Your carotid artery in your neck. You have a temporal artery in your temporal region of your head. You have the brachial here in the crease of your arm, the radial at your wrist, a femoral. And so that's places that we can check and feel for pulses. And now to the heart. And so we've covered this pretty well over the past day or two. Some of you may be very sick and tired of hearing about it. You may be even fixing to fast forward me. Had to say it real quick so I could get it in there before you did, but that's fine. If you feel comfortable with it, yeah, skip ahead. Let's just talk about the anatomy real quick. Left atrium. We have the right atrium, the left ventricle, and the right ventricle. Those are your four chambers. Here's your superior vena cava and inferior vena cava, top and bottom. Remember, blood's flowing down here from the brain and the head, entering the superior vena cava, and blood from the extremities coming back through the inferior vena cava. But they all land right here in the right atrium. From the right atrium through the tricuspid valve, down to the right ventricle, and then up through the pulmonary artery. Here's your left pulmonary artery here, and your right pulmonary artery, because we have two lungs, it's going to go both ways. And so from your pulmonary artery to your lungs, down to the capillary beds we go for that gas exchange, and then back up from the pulmonary veins into the left atrium through the bicuspid valve. Remember, try before you buy. And then down to the left ventricle and up and out through the aorta and clearing the aortic arch and then out to the body. That's the pathway. That's how it works. And we go back to the lungs for a second in order to kind of show you that gas exchange and how the circulatory system is a major piece and player in this game. So here's your bronchial, and then your bronchi, your bronchioles and your bronchioles leading down to your alveoli that'll be down here at the bottom. And then to your alveoli, which is at the bottom of the bronchial tree, at the very bottom. And on top of that lies the capillary bed. Here's an example right here next to this is the capillary bed. Here's your pulmonary vein. Okay. So we have blood coming to the lungs via the pulmonary artery. Comes here, makes the gas exchange back into the pulmonary vein, and then back around into the left atrium. So pretty neat stuff going on here. The arteries carry blood away from the heart, veins carry blood to the heart. It works out good, even though it's a different color here than normal. Arteries, the pulmonary artery does carry blood away from the heart. It carries it to the lungs. Okay. And, oh man, I'm trigger happy again today. All right. And then we know the veins do carry blood back to the heart. Okay, because it's coming back into the left atrium. So artery first, vein last. A comes before V. We talk about, maybe even if it helps you, to split it in two. You have an oxygen-rich side, which is your left side of your heart, and an oxygen-poor side, which is the right side of your heart. Blood doesn't mix, and that helps you. Already kind of talked about the four chambers. We've already kind of covered pretty much the anatomy. We have the tricuspid valve located in between the right atrium and ventricle. Remember these valves, what they do, they just prevent blood from backing up. Okay, it prevents blood from backing up. So if you have blood backing up into the body and you were told that a valve was involved, possibly, then it would definitely be your tricuspid valve. And the same for, if we look at it here in a second, maybe, the bicuspid valve. Bicuspid valve, it's a picture of one. It's located in between your left atrium and left ventricle. If blood's backing up into the lungs, we just got to trace it back. So go to your lungs. We know blood, once it's in the lungs, comes back to the left atrium via the left vein, via the vein, the pulmonary vein, right? And so then obviously the next stop here is going to be the left atrium, and bam, your bicuspid valve. So you would have a problem here if you have blood backing up into the lung tissue from the bicuspid valve. We talked about the electrical system of the heart, right? Completely separate from the heart muscle itself. This is automaticity. This is where the electrical stimulus comes for the heart to contract, and the pacemaker, we like to call it, is the SA node. It sets that normal, regular contraction rate for the heart. We have the AV node, and then we split off into the left and right branches. And as we go down, we start calling these the Perfusion fibers. And they surround the ventricles here. So that's your electrical fuse box. And just more slides showing that oxygen poor blood returns from the body, enters that right atrium. This is kind of walks us through it. We've already walked through it. I don't think we really need to continue walking through it. Here, it's just another, just trying to get you guys to see it. The pulmonary artery here is blue. Okay. And pulmonary artery is taking what? That's right, deoxygenated blood down to the capillary bed, which is this capillary bed, or you can call it a worm bed if you want to. But you need to look for capillary bed and not on the exam and not worm bed. But look, blue, it's bringing deoxygenated blood down here to the capillary bed where CO2 is being dropped off because there is more CO2 here in this pulmonary artery than there is here in this alveoli. So we're going to diffuse, we're going to move from a higher concentration to a lower concentration. Higher concentration of CO2 that we just picked up from the body, lower concentration of CO2 found in the alveoli. The O2 setting in the alveoli is going to diffuse from its higher concentration point into the lower concentration point. And it's going to then turn into the pulmonary veins, represented by the red. And here we go. We're going to make our trip back up and back to the left atrium. We talked about how we assess the circulatory system. And I don't know, just talk about that in a second. And here's just another image, just to allow you to see a little bit better. Okay, we have capillaries of the body up here that need to get rid of CO2 and pick up O2. Up here and down here. And coming from the lungs back to the left atrium. So now we have oxygenated blood through this aortic valve and then out to the body. And as we go, we drop off O2, we drop off O2, and we're picking up CO2. And once we get full of CO2, the process returns, and that happens for the inferior portion, and then up here, the superior portion. We saw this video in class. Just a couple of terms. I don't know if I mentioned it in class, but probably need to start learning these. Perfusion. It's the delivery of oxygen and nutrients to the cells and the removal of the waste products. Hypo, meaning low perfusion. Low perfusion in this case, if we're talking about delivering oxygen and nutrients, is insufficient. There's not enough to deliver, right? So you go on Amazon, you found something really nice, you ordered it, and you open the box and it's empty. You received a hypoperfused package from Amazon. Not that they would do that, but just saying. Hypoperfusion leads to an increased amount of CO2. Why? Because nobody's there to pick it up. CO2 turns into acid, and we will learn from the next chapter that buildup of acid also leads to a loss of heat. Let's talk about blood pressure and systolic blood pressure. So systolic blood pressure lets us know, back up. There we go. Systolic blood pressure is a measurement of the effectiveness of the pumping function of the left ventricle. Okay? Lets us know that the left ventricle has enough volume of blood to pump out to where? Right. Up the aorta and out to the body. Then we could talk about diastolic blood pressure, and just to cut to the chase, it lets us know the size of the vessels. Okay, it lets us know, are they dilated or are they constricted? So that's going to come down to resistance, and that's what we really measure. If they're vasoconstricted, then we're going to have an increased resistance. Right, the thumb over the water hose, that's vasoconstriction. And when it dilates, take your thumb off that hose and you don't have as much pressure, that's dilation. Hydrostatic pressure, we talked about this in class, and the force that the heart is pumping against. All right, so here we go. Take a look at this. So if blood pressure is high, that means this pressure coming through here is going to be extremely high. Well, the left side of the heart has to make corrections for that. If the blood pressure is high, it has to pump against a higher pressure, meaning it has to pump harder to get that blood up and out around that aortic arch. But once it does that, you've got blood rushing out that aortic arch and down the hill, okay, and back into the capillaries. Now, when it gets into these capillaries, the capillaries, remember, they're very small capillaries. Let's see if I can get away from this video and get back to a capillary. They're small capillaries. Okay, so these capillaries can't handle that kind of rushing blood down to them. It needs to come in its regular, normal volume and speed. If that speed's too much, it doesn't know how to handle it. And then the plasma part of the blood will start leaking out. And we know that plasma part is mostly water. And that's where you get That's where you're going to get that edema, also known as swelling in your feet, upper extremities. So in order to have hydrostatic pressure, you have to have an increase in the velocity and volume. It means that blood pressure is going to be high, and you're going to have an increase in hydrostatic pressure. Osmotic pressure, we'll talk about more of that in Chapter 8, but that's going to bring, once we restore the blood pressure, that's what's going to bring it back into the vascular system and reduce the swelling. If the alveoli are involved, and they will be, they're going to start absorbing that water around them and into the alveoli itself. And just like anything else, if you cover these alveoli, they're not going to work properly. They're not designed to have anything covering them. And if anything does, you're going to have a poor gas exchange. We talked about this. We were going to introduce it in Chapter 8. I'm sorry, we're going to talk about it in Chapter 8, but I'm introducing it now. Cellular metabolism. Cells, remember, cells make what? Tissues. Tissues make what? Organs. And organs make what? Organ systems. And so what ends up happening here is the cell has to have energy to survive in order to build tissue. They just don't get born, and if you don't feed them, they'll die. Their food is oxygen and glucose. And once oxygen comes into the cell and glucose is there waiting on it, you're going to have a reaction. And just like any chemical reaction, you get byproducts. like 1 plus 1 equals 2. All right, simple math. Oxygen plus glucose will give you CO2, H2O that we know is water, and heat. All right, CO2 we can eliminate, right, through the respiratory system. H2O, the water, we're going to reuse that. And we're going to use that heat to heat up the body. If that all works as properly planned out, just like I spoke it, we will know that as aerobic metabolism. Now, if oxygen is not present in the cell, think about that for a second. What could cause that? Well, there's lots of cause that. Hypoxia, hypoperfusion. I'm just mentioning that a minute ago. But yeah, that could cause this. If oxygen doesn't come into the cell as designed, we get very little something called ATP. Okay, because that's produced when oxygen and glucose combine as part of that chemical reaction. You're going to have an increased amount of CO2, more than normal. We can't get rid of too much CO2. We can only get rid of what we are designed to get rid of. If we have an increase in CO2, that's going to lead to something else. That's going to lead to something known as lactic acid. And lactic acid is a bad thing for our cells. We're going to lose that heat that we talked about gaining a minute ago because we won't have the proper reaction. And like I said, CO2 leads to asthma. This is known as anaerobic metabolism. Anna, she don't play. Anna can be very mean. And that leads us to the next topic or in our next video over the nervous system. So, gotta study hard. We did finish this chapter in class today. This will be the last video, will be the last part of this chapter over the nervous system, and we'll talk a little bit about alpha and beta in here as well. Hope you have a great day, and I'll see you guys tomorrow.